my title is Can an Extended Science Bridge the Worlds of Matter, Mind and Spirit? And I should say that I was slightly ambivalent about whether I should use the word physics or whether I should use the word science. In some sense, science is more appropriate because it's a broader term, but I am a physicist, and a lot of what I say will relate to physics in particular. And when I talk about the worlds of matter and mind and spirit, I've indicated them in this opening diagram in three circles. And the point is that most of us spend our time in these three worlds: the world of matter, the physical world, the world of mind, our thoughts, and the world of spirits. And obviously the amount of time we spend in these worlds varies from person to person. But what I want to emphasize is that it's very important to understand how these three worlds interact if we're going to have a unified view of the universe. So let me start off by taking this diagram of the three worlds and explain how it can be interpreted in various different ways. First of all, one can sometimes think of these worlds as referring to modes of knowing. So we have senses associated with the matter world, reason associated with the mental world, and contemplation associated with the spiritual world. Also, one can think of them in terms of academic disciplines. So we've got the sciences, we've got the humanities, and we've got religious studies. We could also think about them in terms of esoteric traditions as being associated with different embodiments. So, for example, in the Theosophical tradition, you would have your physical body and your mental body and your spiritual body. And those might be associated, if you like, with different planes of existence. But I have to be a little bit careful here because, of course, the esoteric traditions are more complicated than just talking about three worlds. I mean, if we think about the Theosophy, I'm not an expert in Theosophy, but my understanding is that you have 7 planes of reality in Theosophy, as depicted by this colourful diagram here. If you go to other traditions, for example, if you go to the Kabbalistic tradition, this is the Kabbalistic tree, you have 4 worlds. So saying that we've just got the 3 worlds of matter, mind and spirit may be a bit of a simplification, because obviously we can divide those worlds in various elaborate ways. But for present purposes, I'm just happy to talk about them as the 3 worlds. And I suppose what's most relevant in our own personal lives is that these 3 worlds represent different paths in life. So, for example, you may have the scientist in the world of matter, you may have the artist in the world of mind, and you have the mystic in the world of spirit. Now, of course, we aren't all in just one of these worlds. We're all 3 of these to some extent, and obviously it's just a question of balance. But if one looks at people who are very successful in life, they're normally people who focus on one particular world. A very successful scientist is mainly interested in the world of matter. A very successful artist or a composer is very much in the world of art, and a successful mystic is normally focusing very much in the spiritual domain. But although it's important that humanity as a whole has to cover all of these 3 worlds, one understands that individuals are doing it to a different extent. But one point I want to make in this talk is that actually it is important, for some people at least, to try and encompass all 3 of these worlds. And indeed, that it's important for humanity as a whole to understand how all these 3 worlds interact. And I thought it might be useful just to start off with, from a personal perspective, to show how these 3 worlds have interacted in my life. Really, my story begins when I was a schoolboy, aged about 15. I was at a public school called Harrow, and one time I misbehaved. I won't go into the details, and as a punishment for my misbehaviour, I was roomed, which meant that I was confined to my room apart from lessons. And having nothing else to do, I decided to spend the time reading some books, and I read 3 books. The first book was called The ABC of Relativity by Bertrand Russell, and this introduced me to Einstein's theory of relativity, which whetted my appetite, I guess, for physics, the nature of space and time. The second book I read was J.W. Dunn, An Experiment with Time, in which he talked about some of his precognitive dreams and how he had his own theory called serial time, which tried to explain how one could have precognitions. So this got me very interested in psychic phenomena, experiences that seem to go beyond the normal physical explanations. And the third book I read was called The Third Eye by Lobsang Rampa, and that got me interested in Buddhism and in the spiritual domain. Now, Lobsang Rampa was allegedly a Rinpoche who'd taken over the body of a Cornish fisherman. I'm not sure how much credence we should give to that, but at least it was a fascinating account of various phenomena which were experienced in Tibet along the mystical tradition. And so these books got me interested in basically in physics, psychical research, and religious studies. When I went to Cambridge, I immediately joined 3 university societies. I joined the Astronomical Society, which was, of course, continuing in my exploration of the world of physics, the material world. I joined the CU Society for Psychical Research, and I joined the CU Buddhist Society. Then, when I graduated, I had to decide what career to pursue, and in the end I decided I was actually spending more of my time in my psychic and Buddhist activities than I was really in my mathematical studies. I was a mathematician as an undergraduate. But nevertheless, I decided that I would become a professional astronomer. And I did my Ph.D., in fact, with Stephen Hawking, who wasn't quite so famous in those days. But I did carry on pursuing my interest in psychical research and religious studies, but albeit with less time than I had before. And so now I'm retired just a few years ago, so I'm still active in my research, but I'm now able to spend more time on these three areas, and in particular psychical research and Buddhist societies. But the key point was that not only was I aware of these 3 worlds, but I felt it was really important to try and link these 3 worlds. My ambition was to have a theory of physics which would accommodate psychic and spiritual phenomena. And that really, from the age of 15, was my aim. And I think I decided, well, I better become a professional physicist if I'm going to do that. But the way things happened, of course, when I became an academic, I spent so much time on my professional activities as an academic, teaching and doing research and administration, that I didn't have so much time to fulfill my dream. However, I did have a theory for how I could merge these worlds, and I've been working on that theory for the last 50 years, I suppose. And so that's just a bit about my own personal life. But let me get back now to the more general considerations. The point I want to make in this talk is that it's very important to make bridges between these 3 worlds. For me personally, those bridges are represented by 3 particular topics: Psychical research I see as being the link between matter and mind. Transpersonal psychology, which is the branch of psychology which studies mystical-like experiences, I see as being the link between mind and spirit. And the link between between matter and spirit, I see, for example, being my work on the anthropic principle, which is something I worked on quite a lot in my cosmological context. I should point out that in my professional field, I became a cosmologist. That's why I worked with Stephen Hawking. But I should say that those bridges just represent my personal interests, and people coming from different domains of would see other links, but I'm not going to talk about them in all generality. So let me just make a few remarks about bridge building in general. The first point, just to repeat what I just said, is that there are many bridges. If you are a doctor, you will see different links between scientific medicine and mind, psychotherapy, and things like that than if you are an astronomer like me. Obviously, a musician may see a link between music and spirituality, and as may an artist. But so I think that's obvious. I'm not going to try and cover all the different bridges. Even if we do aspire to bridge all these three worlds, we're still only going to see a very small part of the rich nexus of connections between them. The other point I want to make is that being on a bridge is not easy. It's actually rather stressful. And here's one of my pictures I like. This is the famous picture of the Scream. Being on a bridge is rather painful because you tend to find that you get criticized by people on either side of the bridge. For example, I told you I was interested in psychical research, which I see as representing a link between matter and mind. However, the people on the side of it, therefore, if you like, represents a link between physics and psyche. But that is not a popular view. I mean, most of my physicists don't share my interest in psychic phenomena. Most physicists don't even believe they exist. And people who come from the for example, from the spiritual side, they are often rather skeptical of attempts to try and reduce these experiences to physics. So although I'm saying it's important to build bridges, you've got to realize it won't make you popular. People will tend to be, they will be throwing things at you from either side. But nevertheless, I think it's important to do. And the other thing I want to stress is that one should make a distinction between building a bridge in one's personal life and a conceptual bridge between these three worlds. I've referred primarily to the personal aspect. From a personal point of view, how do you balance these three worlds, these three activities in your own life? And that can be a challenge, because it's like three different parts of your own persona which you have to reconcile. And actually, a lot of people take the view that you shouldn't try and build a bridge between these three worlds at all. They're sort of they're independent magisteria. That we all contain these three worlds, and we don't really need to reconcile. They're there. We just have to live with them. That may be true from a pragmatic point of view, but what I'm really going to be talking about mostly in this talk about the need to have a conceptual model which is going to link these three worlds. And let me just say, well, why is it helpful to build a bridge? Well, let's just talk about the link between science and religion, which is probably the bridge which is most often talked about. A lot of people devote their lives to talking about how you can link up science and religion. And so, how does science help religion? Well, just to give a very simple example, which relates to my own interest, psychical research. one thing psychical research does, it provides evidence for the veracity of transpersonal experiences, i.e. spiritual experiences. And it also provides possible evidence for things like survival of consciousness after death, reincarnation, and things like that. That doesn't mean to say that everybody in psychical researcher believes in those things, but it's something where we try and examine the evidence, and we do it scientifically, because the important thing is psychical research aims to be a branch of science. And I've just flashed up here 6 books, which are relatively recent and which have got a lot of attention. There's the book by Dean Radin on the conscious universe, Ian Stevenson's work on children who remember previous lives, David Fontana, a book, Is There an Afterlife? Pim van Nommel's book, Consciousness Beyond Life, about near-death experiences. And then the book by Bruce Brayson called After, on near-death experiences, and also the book appropriately called Before by Jim Tucker on children's memories of previous lives. They're in the same institute, so it's nice the titles of their book match. Now, how does religion help science? Maybe this is a little bit more controversial. I'm very interested in the way in which people claim to get clairvoyant insights into the nature of reality through spiritual means. And because of my interest in Buddhism, for example, I'm interested in the traditions that Buddha himself and his disciple were able to get insights into the nature of the physical universe essentially through clairvoyance. And these are recorded in the Visuddhimagga. And I don't have time to go to this in much detail, but Buddha claimed that he had information about the physical world going beyond the earth, and indeed he could allegedly even sort of assess the progress of his disciples by how far they could interpenetrate the galactic space and things like that. He would have visions about the time scale of for the future of the universe and past universes and things like this. Now, obviously, most modern cosmologists are not going to take this too seriously. But because I'm interested in clairvoyance, I don't see any reason in principle why one should not have clairvoyant insights into the nature of physical reality. I could give a whole talk on that topic, but I'm not going to do that now. It's a little bit ironic, though, because in some sense we have the International Space Station, which is probing the history of the universe and costs hundreds of billions of dollars. And for one thing, for example, it's getting information about, the history, well, not just the space station, but the various space satellites. But then you've got the idea that you've got, if you like, the inner space station, where someone is just able to sit down and get clairvoyant insights into the nature of the reality of the physical universe. Well, obviously, that's not popular with scientists because they're spending hundreds of billions of dollars trying to get this information. So they don't want to be told that you can get the same information by sitting quietly and having clairvoyant insights. However, it's just an example of how, in principle, religion can help science. And of course, since I'm talking to the Theosophical Society, I should mention, of course, that Theosophy also claims to have had clairvoyant insights into the nature of subatomic physics through clairvoyance and things like that. I'm not going to talk about that because people in this audience will know much more about that than I do. So how do you link this? Over the last, over about a period of 10 years, I would occasionally visit the Esalen Centre, where they set up a centre for theory and research. And the aim of this group, they would meet once a year, was to try and find links between science and spirituality, if you like. And I think the best thing I can do is to quote something which comes from one of their books. We think it requires astonishing hubris to dismiss en masse the collective wisdom and experience of a large proportion of our forebears, including persons widely recognized as pillars of all human civilization. and we believe that the single most important task confronting all of modernity is that of meaningful reconciliation of science and religion. So one needs a middle way between the polarized fundamentalisms of science and religion, an enlarged conception of nature anchored in science and including spiritual realities. So when I talk about linking science and religion, and indeed the world of mind, I'm talking basically of an expanded science, and that's why I have the title of the talk, An Expanded Science. That they produced, incidentally, this group, two really important books: Irreducible Mind, which was providing the evidence for so-called rogue phenomena. These are the phenomena which don't fit into the normal conventional scientific worldview, psychic and spiritual phenomena. And a second volume, more theoretical, called Beyond Physicalism. And actually, I myself wrote a chapter for that, and I will be talking about that later on in this talk. So, but the point is, when I talk about connecting these three worlds, because I'm a scientist, what I'm really saying is we need to extend science to accommodate these three worlds. So when I talked about conceptually linking the worlds, as opposed to just in one's personal life, I was referring really to the possibility that you can extend science to accommodate mental and spiritual phenomena. You see, normally you think of science is this red circle here, you think of science as being associated with the material world. But really, what I'm arguing is that you should be able to extend science to accommodate the mental world, to accommodate conscious experience, for example. And that now is not such a heretical thought, because quite a lot of even physicists are quite interested now in the possibility of extending science to accommodate consciousness because of the interest in neuroscience and artificial intelligence and things like that. And of course, the point of psychical research is that it's trying to extend science to accommodate mind. But I want to go one stage further. I want to say that actually maybe we need a science which accommodates all three. And actually that's a big step, because whereas some scientists may be happy to extend science to accommodate mind, few scientists are happy extending it to accommodate spiritual realities. But nevertheless, I'm going to argue that's what we need to do. And I must plug the Scientific and Medical Network. It's an organization I'm closely allied with. I'm actually the president of this organization. And in particular, they have recently, in the last few years, produced what's called the Galileo Commission report. And this is basically saying how you can have an expanded science that goes beyond the materialist worldview. It's sometimes called a post-materialist science. And this book can be found on, well, it can be bought or found on their website. And in some sense, what I'm going to be talking about is going to be very much in the spirit of a post-materialist science. Now, in a sense, those are my introductory remarks. And what I want to do now, I want to start talking about physics itself. And because in order to explain how I can expand physics, I have to start off by explaining what physics is. But I'm going to try and do this in a way which isn't too technical. Now, this is my favorite diagram. This is the so-called cosmic Ouroboros. It's the snake which is biting its own tail. And around the body of the snake, I've got various objects which exist in the physical universe. So, for example, if I start at the bottom, I have human beings. If I go to the right, I get successively larger objects, because you can think of this as having every minute, if you like, corresponds to a decade of scale. So when I go to the right, I'm going to larger scale. So I've got mountains, the planet, the sun, the solar system, constellations, the galaxy, and then the universe. When I go to the To the left, I see successively smaller things like an ant, an amoeba, DNA, molecule, atoms, nuclei, and then subatomic physics. And so I'm going to ever smaller scales. And so actually, this Ouroboros, it spans something like 60 decades of scale. From the smallest conceivable scale to the largest conceivable scale, scans a factor of 60. That's why I said you can think of every minute as being a factor of 10. You can see the powers of 10 actually next to the various objects. Now, why this is interesting, because actually this shows the triumph of physics in coming to understand the various scales of structure which exist in our universe. But of course, we didn't start out with that information. And in some sense, the history of physics has been the expansion of our awareness to ever larger and smaller scales. So I'd like to tell the story of physics in just a few minutes by using this diagram. And so let's start off with the outward journey. So we start off at the bottom as human beings. And so we start off with our geocentric view, where the Earth is the center of the universe and the planets go around us, and we've got the fixed stars. We all know that eventually that was overtaken by the heliocentric view from Copernicus, which says that the sun is the center of the universe and the Earth goes around the sun. So there, of course, is the sun in the Ouroboros itself. But then eventually, at the beginning of the 20th century, we had the galactocentric view, which said that actually the universe is our galaxy, which is what we call the Milky Way, that band of light we see, which is really billions of stars. And it was thought, even at the beginning of the 20th century, that the galaxy was all there was. So that was the universe. This isn't our galaxy. This is the Andromeda galaxy, our nearest neighbor. But then it was discovered that actually our galaxy is just one of hundreds of billions of galaxies. That was discovered just about 10 years later. And now we have what's called the cosmocentric view, where actually the universe began with a big bang 14 billion years ago, and we can basically see back to 14 billion light years. So we're seeing galaxies to huge distances, and this is the so-called cosmocentric view. Now we have the view that actually even our visible universe just might be one of a multiverse. I have a vested interest in this because I wrote a book about the multiverse, and it's somewhat speculative. Not every physicist believes in it, but I obviously devoted quite a lot of time to it. So this is a vision of the multiverse. Our physical universe, we're just in one bubble, and our visible universe is just part of one small bubble. So that's the outward journey. But now what about the inward journey? Obviously, the outward journey is dependent on telescopes. The inward journey depends on microscopes and particle accelerators. But let's quickly go through that as well. We started off just seeing things with microscopes like tadpoles and things, but then we were able to study atoms, and then at the beginning of the 20th century we could start studying the nuclei and the centers of atoms, and this is the atomic forces, the nuclear bomb. And then there was the standard model of physics. This is the discovery of the so-called Higgs particle, which was only a few years ago. That's a picture taken from the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And theoretically, we have other ideas like supersymmetry, and on the smaller scale of all, we have what's called M theory, and that's meant to be the sort of theory of physics of the very smallest scales, which is to do with the nature of. It says that everything's made of strings, and it's the nature of the vacuum and things like that. So this is the view of the universe which we've discovered through our outward and inward journey. So I basically summarize in a few minutes what has really taken several hundred years. But it's also another interesting thing about this Ouroboros is that actually there are various forces in nature which connect the microscopic domain on the left with the macroscopic domain on the right. So for example, the electric force connects atoms and solid objects, because the same electric force which keeps the electron in orbit around a proton is what determines the structure of a solid object. The same, the weak and the strong forces which operate inside nuclei also operate inside the sun, and that's how nuclear burning produces the light which we all depend on. There's also electroweak force, which is a sort of unification of the weak and the electric force, and there's the so-called GUT, grand unified theory force, which links the weak and the strong, the weak, the electromagnetic and the strong force. So the forces of nature, which we've also come to understand, link the micro world to the macro world. So this, again, this picture represents the triumph of physics. And because I'm talking about physics, it might be just interesting to just say a little bit about these forces, because one of the great insights of physics is to be showed that all these different forces in the world actually are not separate forces, but they're all unified in some way. So let me give you another slide now. I hope this isn't getting too technical. Well, let me also say that the actual crucial thing, you might ask, why does the head meet the tail? And that is because the very large meets the very small at the Big Bang. Maybe I can explain that. You know that light travels with a finite speed. So when you look at a galaxy a million light years away, you're looking at it as it was a million years in the past. When we look back to, say, 14 billion light years, we're looking back to the universe when it was 14 billion years ago, when it was at the Big Bang. Because the universe is expanding, when you go back in time, it's compressed to a point. And that point, that so-called Big Bang, was 14 billion years ago. So in a funny way, when you look to the furthest distances, you're also looking to when the universe was very, very small. So that's why the very big meets the very small. So if you like, the Big Bang is the culmination of this macro-micro connection. And here's a little picture of the Big Bang. You've got the micro domain on the left and the macro domain on the right. So that's just the top of the cosmic Ouroboros. Now, I now want to say a bit more about the unification of the forces. The electric and magnetic forces, it was realized that they could be unified as part of the electromagnetic force by Faraday and Maxwell. Maxwell came up with his famous electromagnetic equations, and those equations, of course, explain the behavior of light and all sorts of things like that. Now, the weak force is much weaker than and that's associated with radioactive decay, and it used to be thought that it was a separate force, but then it was realized that they're part of the so-called electroweak force. And there's Steve Weinberg, a very bright physicist who was involved in that, and they got the Nobel Prize for that way back in the 1970s. There's also the strong force, which operates in nuclei, and in theory, the strong force can be unified with the electroweak force as part of the grand unification force, what I called the GUT force before. But that's still not been confirmed experimentally, but it's theoretically possible. Now, there is Gerhard de Hooft, who's a famous physicist involved in that theory. But the great dream of physics is to unify gravity, which was discovered by Newton, with these other forces. And the current best hope for that is called M theory. And the one person associated with that is Ed Witten. Ed Witten is a very brilliant physicist, and this M theory goes back to about 1995. It's a variation of string theory. Now, I hope this is not too technical, but I just want to give you an overview that the triumph of physics also involves the understanding of the unification of these forces. And indeed, physicists sometimes say they're on the verge of having a theory of everything. And that brings in my Stephen Hawking, who was my friend and Ph.D. supervisor, and in some sense that was his dream, to have a theory of everything. And many of you may have seen the film, The Theory of Everything. I was privileged to go to the premiere of the film, and it was in London, and so I was sitting next to Stephen during the film, and I know he enjoyed it very much. And so I imagine the headlines the next day: Stephen Hawking finds the theory of everything enjoyable. But actually, the reason I mention this is because there's something rather odd about this. If you've seen the film, you'll know it was not really about the theory of everything. It was about his love affair with his first wife, Jane. But of course, the one thing a theory of everything is not going to explain is something like a love affair. And so actually, it shows to me there's actually something missing from this theory of everything, this picture of physics. So having now spoken for 5 minutes about the triumph of physics, I'm now going to be a bit critical. Because this triumph of physics has something rather odd about it. It's also the triumph of mindlessness, because there's nothing about mind in this picture. Now, we hear a lot about mindfulness nowadays through meditation and things, but there's no mind in this picture at all. So how can one say that we're close to a theory of everything when the most obvious feature of the universe, ourselves, is missing? So to me, this says that physics is not close to a theory of everything. Because from my perspective, mind is a fundamental and not an incidental feature of the universe. And I can depict that by putting right in the middle of the Ouroboros the mind's eye, if you like. Now, this isn't the view of all physicists. A lot of physicists will say mind is just something passive, it's the froth on a purely mechanistic universe. So let me spend a few minutes saying why I think mind is important. And some of these arguments will be fairly familiar to you. The first argument is that, for the significance of mind, is that, first of all, the fact that the universe is comprehensible at all. I think Einstein said that what's really incomprehensible about the universe is the fact we can understand it. But there's a quote that goes back to James Jean: the universe is more like a great thought than a great machine. And it is like that. When you look at that cosmic Ouroboros, it sort of seems to speak of some great intelligence. The way the laws of nature amalgamate in such a beautiful way to provide the universe we see. Another great physicist was called Dirac, and he always emphasized the beauty of the universe. He said it's more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. He was one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. But beauty, of course, is a quality of mind. Now, the other reason that people think, and even physicists think, that mind might be important is because of quantum theory. I think most people are aware that quantum theory completely demolishes the classical view of the world. In quantum theory, you don't have solid objects like billiard balls. You have a wave function which describes physical objects. And so reality is in some sense fuzzy. And the wave function, when you make an observation, the wave function collapses. And so the unique physical reality we see is a result of the collapse of that wave function. And some people think that collapse of the wave function is actually triggered by consciousness. And the person who's most famous for this is maybe Eugene Wigner. And for example, you can have the idea, I talked about the Big Bang. You can imagine the universe begins with a Big Bang, which evolves to produce galaxies and stars and people who then contemplate the beginning of the universe. And then you could argue, in some sense, this produces a closed circuit which brings the universe into existence. This is not the view every physicist take. I mean, I think this was the view John Wheeler took, for example. But at least it brings mind into the question, into our picture. And Henry Stapp, another well-known physicist, he actually says the mind actually plays a role in how the wave function collapses. It can actually influence how the wave function collapses, whereas in mainstream physics it's a sort of random process. And this is relevant if you're trying to explain sort of psychic phenomena, for example. But perhaps best known is David Bohm, who was a quantum physicist who was interested in the more mystical aspects of quantum theory, and he thought that there was a sort of implicate order which underlies the explicit order of the physical world. And he, of course, was also very interested in the links between physics and mysticism. But what's important about this is that it hints that the observer actually does play a role in the physical world and how the physical world appears. This is the famous Escher picture of the hands which are drawing themselves, and this seems to be very relevant. So quantum theory is the other reason for thinking mind is important. Other reasons, I've been very interested in the fine-tunings. The fact that the physical constants in the universe seem to be fine-tuned in order that there can be observers. I don't have time to go into that. I could give a whole talk on the anthropic fine-tunings. It's called the anthropic principle. Anthropic is the Greek word for man or human being. A very bad term because it's not really anything to do with human beings. It's just the condition that complexity can arise in some sense. But some physicists try and say this is just coincidental and it's philosophy or even theology. I've never argued that. I mean, I've been working on this subject. I wrote my first paper on this topic with Martin Rees way back in 1979. And at that time, it was a rather heretical topic, but now it's almost mainstream. There are these unexplained tunings. And one of the possible explanations of those is the multiverse. I refer to the multiverse in an earlier slide. Here's my book on the subject, but I just have to plug, sorry about that, Universe or Multiverse. And this is just some of the recent developments in cosmology and particle physics suggest that our universe, rather than being unique, could just be one of many universes. Since the physical constants can be different in other universes, the fine-tunings which appear necessary for the emergence of life may be explained. So the idea is that most universes are stillborn, there's no consciousness, but if the conditions are right, as they're going to be by chance, in some universes, we are necessarily in one of those universes and they are conscious. So again, this hints that consciousness in some sense is playing a role in selecting the universe. But maybe the final reason, which to me is maybe most cogent of all, although somewhat controversial, is psi, which is the general term for psychic phenomena. If psi is real, it requires some link between matter and mind. Now, I better just explain what I mean by psi. It includes phenomena like telepathy, where we know what's in each other's minds, clairvoyance, when we can see what's going on somewhere else in the universe, but through some non-standard sensory system, obviously, precognition, where we see the future, and even psychokinesis, where we have some effect on a physical system. So I focus on my wine glass and it starts levitating. But the point about these phenomena is that if they're real, they involve an interaction between consciousness and the physical world. If that's true, your theory of physics must expand to explain this. It must accommodate consciousness. Now, of course, most physicists don't believe in the phenomena. But to be honest, that's just because they haven't had the experiences. I do believe at least some of the phenomena, and that's why, and because I'm a passionate physicist, I'm impressed by the triumph of physics. I want to expand physics to accommodate these phenomena. Not all people who believe in psychic phenomena want to do that because they don't share my love of physics. Some people like to think this shows that physics doesn't explain everything. But nevertheless, that's my aim, is to expand physics. So as I've just said, the irony is that this does attract opposition from both physicists and parapsychologists. Most parapsychologists, I should say, have a background in psychology. And so they're not so interested in physics. They're more interested in the link with psychology. Now, the final reason why I think consciousness is important is that I told you the story of physics and how it's basically an expansion of consciousness. But if I can represent this historically as an expansion of the micro-macro frontier of our consciousness with time. remember, we started off in prehistoric days looking at very local things, so we would only see a narrow range of length scales. But as time went on, we could see more and more of the universe. So by the 16th century, we had telescopes and microscopes, so we could see. This is just the Ouroboros scales being represented here. By the 20th century, we could see, we could see to the galaxy and beyond, and we could see to the nuclear physics. Now in the 21st century, we more or less can see to the edge of the visible universe, and we can't yet see to the smaller scales of all, but we can see, for example, to the scale associated with the Higgs boson. So we haven't quite completed the circle there. So to me, it's rather ironic. The history of science is the history of the expansion of consciousness. So to me, it's rather ironic that most physicists want to keep consciousness out of the picture. And in fact, the history of physics is really a sequence. It's a history of paradigm shifts, which itself is a history of a sequence of mental models. And so, let me just summarize this. If we look at the Ouroboros again, the theory of physics on the small scale is called quantum theory, and the theory of physics on the large scale, the macro scale, is relativity theory. These two theories work with exquisite precision in their own domains, but the problem is these two theories are not compatible with each other. They're inconsistent. And so the great challenge of physics is to have a final theory which will reconcile quantum theory and relativity theory. We still don't have that theory. However, that final theory, that's what people are looking for. That's what Hawking was looking for. I would speculate that the final theory, the marriage of quantum theory and relativity theory, will accommodate mind in some sense and accommodate consciousness. And another way of looking at this is to say that, well, maybe it's also the end of the matter-centric view. You remember I talked about the history of physics involves going from the geocentric to the heliocentric to the galactocentric to the cosmocentric view. Maybe the next paradigm is going to go beyond the matter-centric view. Because when I talk about a paradigm of science which incorporates mind or even spirituality, I'm going beyond the matter-centric view. That's why I referred earlier to the post-materialist paradigm. So that's my general introduction, if you like, to why we need to have such a theory. Now, and so here's just another famous diagram. Science explores ever wider domains of space, thereby providing ever-growing maps of material reality. That's what the cosmic Ouroboros is. But the question is, are there other types of space? And are there other levels of non-material reality? And really, the fundamental question here is now to do with the nature of consciousness. Because what connects these three worlds, be it matter, mind, or spirit, is consciousness. And so the question we really got to address is, what is the nature of consciousness? And I'm just going to have a little 5-minute discussion of consciousness now. And really, you've got two views. Some scientists take the view that consciousness is not fundamental. John Watson, who was the founder of behaviorist psychology, says the time seems to have come when psychology must discard all reference to consciousness, when it need no longer delude itself into thinking that it is making mental states the object of observation. So here's a psychologist saying that consciousness is not important. On the other hand, contrast that with the view of the philosopher David Chalmers. I propose that conscious experience can be considered a fundamental feature, irreducible to anything more basic. Now, I personally am going to side on the yes side, but I want to try and be balanced in my presentation. But then the next question is it relevant to physics? It could be fundamental, but just not be part of physics. Well, Schrödinger, who was a quantum physicist, he thought consciousness was fundamental. However, he says, although I think that life may be the result of an accident, I do not think that of consciousness. Consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. So Schrödinger would have said it's not part of physics. On the other hand, Roger Penrose says, my position on consciousness demands a major revolution in physics. There is something very fundamental missing from our current science. Our understanding at this time is not adequate, and we're going to have to move to new regions of science. And so that is what I'm also arguing. I'm arguing we have to expand science to accommodate consciousness, and that may happen when you have your final theory. And in that, Roger would agree with me that consciousness is going to be part of the final theory. He wouldn't agree with when I say that you can go on and expand it to incorporate mystical phenomena, because I don't think he's so enamored with mystical phenomena. Now, then the next question is really crucial. Is consciousness generated by the brain? Well, someone like Sir Francis Crick says, a person's mental activities are entirely due to the behaviour of nerve cells, glial cells, and the atoms and ions and molecules that make up and influence them. So the view of not only Crick, but probably 99% of neuroscientists is that consciousness generates the brain. It is generated by the brain. Okay? But not everybody says that. For example, Steve Pinker, who's a psychologist, how could consciousness possibly arise from the physical brain? Beats the heck out of me. I have some prejudice, but no idea of how to begin to look for a defensible answer, and neither does anyone else. Neuroscientists can study correlates between brain function and experience. Nobody has the faintest idea how the brain actually generates unitary experience, how it generates consciousness. Of course, the hope is they will eventually, but some of us feel that that hope is forlorn. And then going one stage further, because if you don't think consciousness is generated by the brain, you might say, well, in that case, why do we think consciousness dies with the brain? I mean, obviously the mainstream view is when the consciousness dies, when the brain dies, so does your consciousness. But there is, of course, the question of, does consciousness survive death, which is obviously an important religious question. So here is my friend and teacher, Stephen Hawking. I regard the brain as a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There is no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. That is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. Well, sadly, Stephen died a few years ago, of course, and I don't know whether he's changed his mind. I hope so. But there is another view, which comes from Sir John Eccles, for example, the Nobel laureate neurophysiologist. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world. And I'm not going to claim to know whether, that there is a soul which can survive death. But nevertheless, that is a really crucial question, and I regard it as an open question and very relevant to religion. People go further and say that actually what's important about psi is that it's evident that mind is in some sense non-local. This is a concept which arises from quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics in some sense transcends the locality, and we know this happens in a subatomic context, but some people argue that you can have non-local mind on a larger scale. Here's Dean Radin. Minds are entangled with the universe, so in principle minds can non-locally influence anything, including a collection of other minds or physical systems. So this is saying that our minds don't interact with the universe just through our normal sensory apparatus, or just through our brains. And here's a similar remark from William Broad. It may be that our deep interconnectedness with each other and with all of nature is the major conclusion that issues forth from the many findings of consciousness research. Well, I'm talking about psi But it's not just psi. You can look at more, you might say normal, but in another sense more transpersonal phenomena. For example, creativity. Thomas Edison, a famous inventor, people say I've created things. I've never created anything. I get impressions from the universe at large and work them out. But I'm only a plate on a record or a receiving apparatus. Thoughts are really impressions we get from outside. And here's another composer. Here's a creator, Gustav Mahler, the composer. My symphony will be something that the world has never heard before. I tell you, at certain places in the score, a quite uncanny feeling takes possession of me, and I feel as if I had not created this myself. So a lot of creative people don't think they're the source of creativity. They think they've got some connection with a greater mind outside. And indeed, I would say both of these things suggest that in some sense there is a form of universal mind which connects our individual minds. This is a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. There is one mind common to all individual men, a universal mind. And here's a similar quote from David Bohm, who I mentioned, the quantum physicist. Deep down, the consciousness of mankind is one. This is a virtual certainty. And if we don't see this, it's because we are blinding ourselves to it. So the idea is that although we seem to be individuals, separate individuals, in some sense this is an illusion because we're all connected at a deep enough level. There's a great book called One Mind by Larry Dossey, which collates all the evidence for this. But this sort of suggests that the brain is not doesn't produce consciousness. It's more of a filter of consciousness, rather like a TV set does not generate the scenes on the TV. It's the brain is just a filter. The TV set is a filter. It receives the signal, but the reality is outside. And so Aldous Huxley, for example, in Doors of Perception says, each one of us is potentially mind at large. But insofar as we are animals, our business at all costs is to survive. To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and the nervous system. And another quote here, what comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which will help us to stay alive on the planet of this particular, on the surface of this particular planet. So the point is, the brain is a filter, and it has to be a filter because that's the only way we're going to survive in this world. It filters out all the information except what we need. But that the idea is that in certain states, the filter is not so efficient. And for example, if you're having a mystical experience or a near-death experience or psychedelic drug or something like that, the filter is weakened, so you gain access to a wider reality. And for example, there's even evidence for terminal lucidity. People who have been suffering from Alzheimer's just before they die, they seem to have a moment of lucidity, which suggests in some sense that they become more lucid as the brain dies. And of course that's a feature of near-death experiences as well. Now this is not the popular view. This is not the mainstream view. The mainstream view is that the brain is a producer of consciousness and there is no universal mind, there is no filter. But I'm suggesting to you that what we're going to need in this new paradigm is the brain as a filter. But how can that be? Isn't there lots of evidence that consciousness is actually generated by the brain? This is another of my favorite diagrams, the pyramid of complexity. It shows how during the Big Bang, increasingly complex structures form. And so you start off at an early time, you have quarks and then nucleons and then later atoms form. After you form galaxies and stars and planets, you form molecules, then biomolecules and cells and organisms. So this is what I call the pyramid of complexity, and it's straightforward physics. It's showing how the development of complexity arises during the Big Bang, providing you have those anthropic tunings. And in that sense, you could just think consciousness is just the latest stage in complexity. The brain is probably the most complex system we're aware of in the universe, and the consciousness is just produced by that. So isn't this saying that consciousness is produced by the brain? That would be the mainstream view. But I would say there's another view, and that is to say, well, no, actually, there could be consciousness with a big C, which in some sense underlies everything, and if you like, even precedes the Big Bang. And consciousness with a big C, that's what you might call the universal mind, and that's what has to be filtered to produce consciousness with a small c. So the idea is that consciousness is primary, and wherever there are physical systems which are sufficiently complex to filter it, then you have a small consciousness with a small c. And you likewise have mind with a big M and mind with a little m. So that's my underlying picture. Now, having said that, I want to say a bit more about psychic and mystical experience, because so far I've mainly talked about psychic experience, but what about mystical experience? You see, if I am a little bit more detailed about the range of psychic phenomena, we've got telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis. I talked about those things before. These are the sort of phenomena which can be studied in the laboratory. You've got more dramatic phenomena, though, which you don't really see in the laboratory. You might have a levitation. You might have a poltergeist where furniture starts being thrown around. You can have an apparition where you apparently see the image of a ghost. You might have a near-death experience and these are well studied. They're quite common phenomena over a huge range of cultures, and they, for example, involve leaving your body and having a near-death experience. Or you might have an out-of-body experience, which doesn't involve necessarily dying, but you still feel some body has left your physical body. But you see, there is a transition between psychic experiences at the top and the more mystical experiences at the bottom. And that's important because I don't think you can make a clear-cut division between psychic and mystical experiences. Even parapsychologists often tend to do that. They tend to say, well, we're not interested in mystical experience, because parapsychologists are trying to say this is part of science. Okay, so you can talk about psychic experiences like telepathy and clairvoyance, but it's really a bridge too far to talk about mystical experiences if you want to convince your mainstream scientist colleagues. I don't accept that. And here's another of my favorite diagrams. It's classifying all the experiences. And on the y-axis, I've got frequency, and on the x-axis, I've got impact. So I go from mundane to profound in terms of impact, and I go from common to rare on the y-axis. And what I want to do, I just want to display all the different experiences that human beings have and put them in this diagram. Ordinary sensations, memories, dreams, these are what you might call normal experiences. We all have them. So notice they're common and mundane. But then we have the experiences which might be called paranormal: telepathy, clairvoyance, distant healing, or PK. So those are the paranormal experiences, which have more impact but are rarer. And then we have what we might call the mystical, spiritual experiences: creative insight, religious epiphany, oceanic feeling, mystical union. So those are the spiritual experiences. And those, of course, are more profound and more rare. And, of course, the people who have these, everybody has those. Healers and psychics have the paranormal ones, and then geniuses and saints have the spiritual experiences. So the point of this diagram is it shows there are a continuum of experiences which go from normal to paranormal to spiritual. And therefore, if one wants a paradigm which is explaining experience, it has to make reference to all of these phenomena. It's no good saying I've got a paradigm which is going to explain paranormal phenomena, but it doesn't explain spiritual phenomena, because we need to explain all three of these types of experiences in one go. And you cannot make a clear distinction between them. Now, let me say what that means in terms of the scientific enterprise. If you look at the normal phenomena, they are common and mundane, and they are studied by scientists in the normal way, and they are uncontroversial. They're studied by physiologists and neuroscientists. On the other hand, the phenomena which are called paranormal, psychical research claims to study those scientifically, but nevertheless they're highly controversial, and that many scientists don't believe the phenomena are real. On the other hand, if you look at the spiritual or mystical experiences, these are very rare and very profound, and it's normally accepted, even by people who are mystical, that they are beyond science. But one needs to have a model which is actually going to accommodate these within the scientific enterprise as well. So let me just draw some conclusions. The point of this talk has been to argue that we need some extension of physics which accommodates experience being the point of that last diagram. And when I say experience, I mean a first person rather than a third person perspective of the world. And this has to incorporate all the domains, normal, paranormal, and transpersonal. The point is, physics is normally assumed to be associated with the third person perspective. So saying that we need a first person physics is quite a dramatic change, and it's going to be necessarily quite a big jump in the nature of physics. And the other point I've made in this talk is that we must have some explicit model of consciousness, because consciousness underlies and links all the three worlds. So let me go back to the diagram I started with. This shows the three worlds of matter, mind, and spirit, with consciousness in the middle. And for example, I might associate matter with normal experiences, mind with paranormal experiences, and the spirit with transpersonal experiences. This is, if you like, another interpretation of the three worlds, of the attributes of the three worlds. So the last diagram was very explicit in describing those three types of phenomena, and we need a paradigm of science which accommodates all of these experiences. Now, the point I'm going to make is that this requires a new paradigm of physics, and it's going to be a higher dimensional model of physics. And I'm going to go on to discuss that in my next talk. So I hope this talk has whetted your appetite to hear about the specific paradigm which I'm going to talk about later on.